Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Katie Monahan. I'm a communications strategist here at the Ohio Arts Council, and I coordinate the OAC's monthly webinar series, and I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, From Procrastination to Preparedness, Mastering All Hazards Planning for Survival and Success. So we will introduce our presenters here in just a minute, but before we dive in, there are, of course, just a few housekeeping items that we need to go over. So first, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, but that doesn't mean that you can't ask questions. If you have a question at any point during the presentation, go ahead and type it into the Q&A box there in your control panel. We'll monitor those questions as we go throughout the webinar, and we'll be sure to hold plenty of time at the end to answer those. Again, please be sure to use the Q&A box and not the chat. It's just easier to track things in the Q&A, and we don't want to miss anyone. And next, live captioning is available for today's webinar, and you can access those captions by clicking on the closed captioning icon in your control panel. If you have audio issues or trouble connecting, we recommend refreshing your browser. And if that doesn't work, try logging off and logging back in. And also, please keep in mind that because we are presenting from different locations, there may be some variations in bandwidth or internet stability. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates for a minute, thank you in advance for bearing with us. I promise we will keep on rolling through any of those little tech issues. And finally, we are recording today's webinar, and that recording will be available on the OAC's webinars page at oac.ohio.gov/webinars and on our YouTube channel by early next week. And everyone who registered for today's webinar will receive a follow-up email containing a link to the recording and a copy of the slide deck. All right, that's it for housekeeping. So now I would like to welcome my colleague, Jared Small. Jared is an arts learning coordinator here at the OAC, and he graciously connected us with today's wonderful presenters through his work that he's been doing with NCAPER. So Jared, thanks so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to, and I think you're going to help introduce our presenters.
That is great. Thank you, Katie, for that introduction, and thanks for your partnership in making this webinar come to fruition. It's really great. So yes, as Katie mentioned, my name is Jared Small, and I am an arts learning coordinator at the Ohio Arts Council. Over the past few years, the OAC has embarked on a journey towards better understanding what our constituents want and need as it relates to disaster planning, readiness, and mitigation efforts. Tornadoes, flooding, shootings, train derailments, blizzards, intense heat waves, the list unfortunately goes on. And it seems like every other day there's a new emergency or disaster we're forced to contend with, whether human or nature-made. But during these times of blue skies and dangers out of sight, we continue to ponder how arts organizations and artistic practices and our collective sector can be more informed, more prepared, more connected in getting ahead of the inevitable. We know the arts can and do have a role to play, both in preparing at the singular level, as well as being part of a wider cross-sector solution. It's in this vein that we're excited today to touch just the tip of the iceberg in what you all can do in developing an action plan to serve as a lifeline when and not if the next crisis, emergency, or disaster arises. Today, we're joined by two fabulous colleagues with a depth of skill and experience in the disaster preparedness field. Tom Clareson is Project Director of Performing Arts Readiness, or PAR for short. PAR is a project funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to help performing arts organizations protect their assets, sustain operations, and prepare for emergencies. Tom also serves as Senior Consultant for Digital and Preservation Services at Lyrasis, where he consults internationally on preservation, disaster preparedness, digitization, funding, strategic planning, and advocacy for arts and cultural organizations. Tom is joined by Jan Newcomb, who is the Executive Director of the National Coalition of Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, or NCAPER for short. And Jan is also the Performing Arts Coordinator for the PAR Project. Throughout Jan's career, she has directed 10 arts organizations, including the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra, the Charleston Symphony Orchestra, arts councils in New York and South Carolina, and a community arts theater, or community arts center rather. So I am so excited that we're able to host this dynamic duo this afternoon for a webinar that I know will be highly informative and resource rich. So with that, Tom and Jan, the virtual floor is all yours.
Well, thank you. And We'll just real quickly give our coordinates here. Jared gave a great introduction, and thank you very much for that. And we want you to have the ability to contact us at any time, both in the questions at the end of this session and afterwards. So here are the emails where you can best reach us, and you can see Jan as a double threat here with her work at PAR and NCAPER, and so she has those two areas for contact as well. And Jan, I think you start, so if you want to take it away, that's great.
Thank you. Now I have to, since I unmuted, I have to find the advanced, there it is. This always happens. Okay, we're starting. Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Jared and Katie. This is really fun to be together, and especially now with all the flooding in Vermont, and we're so worried about just everything going on. And it's important to know that, you know, you can do something about it. So just as some definitions, what is readiness? And even though I'm going to read this to you, it's important to really understand that it's being in a posture to be resilient and prepared for whatever crisis, emergency, or disaster may arise. I always think I was a dancer, and I always feel that it's about really being ready to move, ready to do something, that you've thought about it. You know what your options are. So the readiness plan is really a combination of documents, processes, and training that formulates what your organization and what your leadership and staff will do should the unexpected occur. And it's really the organizational muscle that you train and strengthen over time. And it's never done. Just like a dancer's bar, you do it every day. Think about it, and your whole goal would be for you to think of readiness as part of your culture and your organization, or as an artist as well. So we all know that as devastating the pandemic was for everyone, there has been a wide variety of disasters this past several years, and now we're talking several days, months, and they continue to occur. And they have damaged and will continue to damage many types of arts and cultural organizations. Jared just said that the Vermont Arts Council offices are underwater. And, you know, just think about it, you know, swimming into your office and trying to find everything. It's just devastating. So whether the flooding comes from a hurricane or a bad storm or a leaky pipe, it often has the same disastrous effect. So today we want to talk to you about you as informed, prepared arts leaders can facilitate nimble, coordinated, and effective responses to crises and disasters, and thus create resilience within your organization that can mean the difference between survival and bankruptcy. And as we saw during COVID, bankruptcy is a viable option when people are not prepared. So the effectiveness of all hazard planning is what we want to talk about. Having come to the emergency planning arena late in my career, actually after I stopped working full time, I look back at the crises and disasters that I encountered throughout the years and realized that though on the job experience as an arts leader, I have learned lessons along the way. I could have predicted and prepared for prior to their occurring had I had this kind of information. Sorry, that was my moving van driver leaving. So planning, just remember, planning is cheaper, less stressful, and less expensive than learning on the job. And the latest comparison is every $1 spent on preparedness saves you $7 in recovery expenses. That's huge when you have a small budget. Okay, so objectives. you can read along here, but we've been leading up to understanding why all hazards planning is important for you to know. And what are the goals of an up-to-date all hazards emergency disaster plan? You really need to identify and protect your organization's assets, priority materials, and vital records. This is going to be different for every organization, but every organization has priority materials and assets and records. A useful exercise might be to ask your staff, if they could save one thing, what would it be? I mean, if somebody at the Vermont Arts Council, before leaving for that, before the storm hit, what would have been, what wish you wish you had now is kind of the idea. And getting these answers from various departments and positions better prepares you and it gives you a better picture of how the organization needs to respond and prepare. So actually, all of this reduces the risk of disaster because, as we just talked about, prevention is the cheapest and most effective disaster response. And to ensure your capability to resume operations after a disaster, having a well-conceived plan within the larger planning structure helps you get up and running faster. And Tom and I have seen this, especially during COVID. Those organizations that had plans already were jumping to how do we work online? I mean, it wasn't just, they had already thought through things that needed to be done. They already knew how they were going to be paying staff if the administrative office or venue wasn't being used. Things like that. That saves a lot of time. It saves angst, and it helps your organization focus on what really needs to be done. And it increases your ability to recover damaged or lost assets. This is especially important for any unique or rare materials, such as an orchestra's library of music, theatrical posters, costumes, sets, or props. You've already gone through all this and you know what needs to be saved and you know what needs to be done. So we've talked about the objectives and thinking about there is a mission for a planning committee or as a part of a job description of a staff member tasked with leading emergency preparedness planning. And what we always try to emphasize, it's not a one-person band. You really do need to have, I used to say that, forget the CEO. It's more important to have artistic operations or the backstage people, but it is important to have everybody. So getting input from everybody is a very important thing. And now Tom is going to talk about components of a all hazards plan. Oops.
Great. Oops.
Sorry.
Thank you, Jan. We have a lot of resources that we're going to show you as we go on this afternoon, and including we have a number of sample disaster plans from arts organizations from around the country of all different types that you can take a look at. But we wanted to just give a quick idea of some of the components that you could use to put together one of these all hazards plans. The whole disaster planning process is really a way of gathering information, analyzing your current processes, and developing that plan of action that Jan has been talking about. And it is a working document. It's something that you should update after every disaster. And, they're happening more and more. So it's not just updating it every year, it's updating it maybe a couple of times a year. Some of the most common components of these comprehensive plans are an introduction, the purpose, the author, the organization, and really a schedule of how often this should be updated and the last date revised. If you have a disaster plan that's 5 or 6 years old, you may have had complete staff turnover between now and then, and people who are assigned to things might not still be there. Evacuation plans for staff, performers, and audience is one of the key things to have. A communications plan. I'm going to circle around at the end of the session today. I'm going to talk a lot about how important communications is, but this includes everything from staff contact information and other emergency contacts to how you communicate with your audiences if some type of a disaster happens. The emergency procedures. Specific procedures for responding to a variety of emergencies, including fire, flood, all of those types of activities. And Katie had asked, is this a separate binder or just part of general policies and procedures? It's not bad to have it in both places. You can have it as part of your policies and procedures, but I also think having a brief type of plan or some brief listings of steps to take can be very important. You also think about facility plans. Jan and I always talk about this as what is where in your building? Where are the shutoff valves, the circuit breakers? Do you have floor plans that you can get a hold of quickly? Make sure that those floor plans have remodeling cubes, temporary walls, or anything that you have in there. It really is, with the facility plan, something to reduce surprises. If you're going into your organization like the Vermont Archives people are, they want to have a good plan of where they're going to be, stepping and what they're going to be stepping into. Resource lists. What are your outside emergency personnel that you work with regularly? This can be police, fire, hospital, and then what vendors are out there? Electricians, elevator companies, glass replacement, all of those type of things are important as well. I oftentimes ask, especially with the live classes, to just see a show of hands of how many people could put their hands on their insurance information and their expenditure authorization, and usually no hands go up. Jan is raising her hand, that's good. But I think that in a lot of cases, we may not be super familiar with that. So familiarize yourself with it and who can spend that money. And then response procedures of what the sort of team functions and team activities are, because you're going to have more than just one thing that you need to look at when a disaster happens. There are a lot of ways that disasters impact art and culture organizations and artists. This can happen. The slide covers the consequences of risks and post-disaster needs. So starting at the top, loss of income. This can be from canceled performances, loss of audiences performances, to performances that take place. It can be galas and fundraisers that are canceled, and even classes that you might offer in a theater when a production isn't up. So that's one of the first things. That's really one of the first things that everybody always thinks of. But we need to think about a couple of other things as well. And that can be the damage to property, sets, costumes, scores, but also things including office equipment and files. And for artists, the idea of tools used to create work like paint, paintbrushes, canvases, but also computers again. So thinking about what would happen and what would the impact be if some of the infrastructure of your creative methods is damaged. We go down to the idea of damage or destruction to facilities. And this can be certainly your performance facilities, and that is a real concern. But what about if you have different rehearsal facilities? In Houston, after Hurricane Harvey, we talked to a number of places where maybe they had one of their stages available, but their rehearsal facilities were gone. Or I talked in New Jersey to an organization that had a bad snowstorm, and the roof over their offices, where all of their ticketing systems and everything were held, collapsed. And so their infrastructure for doing their ticketing was gone. And storage. Many of us might have storage 5, 10, 15 miles away. how often do we get over to see what condition those materials are in? And you don't want to go there and find mold all over the walls and wild animals running around. And I'll tell you, from my time I worked in Texas, I had a couple of meetups like that. So thinking about what could happen to your facilities. And then most importantly, health issues. The idea that this can be damaging to life and health of staff, audience, and others. And the other thing is, after disasters, there is emotional impact that might make it difficult for people to perform. So I think we need to look at not just how does it affect our income, but how does it affect all of these things. So with that in mind, what I want us to think of is putting our plans together, thinking of all the ways that we could be affected, and taking into account something that can be very helpful. And that is this sort of emergency management cycle. We can't prevent all of these things from happening, but how can we be more ready for them? And what I'd say is, just introducing the concepts here, a couple of things to look at. Preparedness is the idea of planning for a disaster, putting together some supplies that might be able to bring your facilities and practice back up to speed, and building a team. As Jan said a couple of slides ago, we don't want one person to have this as their assignment. I always don't want to have a lone wolf emergency planner. That's what I always say in an organization. I want everybody to be thinking about how they can do this. Response. This is what happens in the immediate first 48 to 72 hours. This is what we're working on the people who are in Vermont with right now, where we're talking to them about what's going to happen as soon as you get that water out of your facility. And this is the kind of stuff that you do possibly before help can arrive. This is some of the things that you can do on your own. Recovery can be short-term, and you need to think about, is our recovery going to be able to reopen our facility, or do we need to do our performances from a different facility somewhere in our city, somewhere in our region? And it can also be long-term. I worked with a library that was struck by lightning, had a fire, and a number of different situations that caused all sorts of damage to the building in Arkansas. It took them 2 years to be able to open up again. During those 2 years, they offered services, but it was from the storefront of an old grocery store. So, can you think about what you would need to do long-term? And then mitigation, we're circling back around to the top. What can you do to mitigate the disaster and make the next time be less severe or less damaging? What have we learned? So let me talk a little bit about why we need to work with the emergency management system. And that sector includes local and county offices of emergency management. There are 88 of those in our state. It includes the State Office of Emergency Management, Federal Emergency Management Agency. The alphabet soup below there is VOADs and COADs. That is volunteer organizations active in disasters and community organizations active in disasters, and hospitals. All of those are great groups to be able to help us do some of this planning, preparedness, response, and things that are at the top of the screen. But the gaps that we have seen is information tailored specifically to arts organizations and resources for lost income to our organizations and to ourselves as artists. There's a lot of great conservation and preparedness advice out there from organizations like ICA, the Intermuseum Conservation Association up in Cleveland. But until recently, not a lot of this was directed towards arts organizations. So where can we get good arts advice? We need money for repair of tools, and we're continuing to work with Congress to pass some of that, and money for repair of facilities, and resources for individual artists. So with the work that NCAPER and a number of other organizations are doing, we are trying to sort of promote ways to fill these gaps. And we have some partners who are doing some work in readiness, response, and recovery. I'll talk about all of these pretty quickly here, but we have NCAPER, Jan's organization that does a lot of advocacy and networking for disaster preparedness and education as well. We have, through PAR, training, resources, and funding. Up at the top, there's the Arts Ready Plan, a automated disaster planning tool that can help you put together your plans. And we see sort of getting spit out of the gears here is Surf Plus, the Craft Emergency Relief Fund that works with individual artists. And then we have a group that we work very closely with called the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, which is a combination between the American Institute for Conservation and FEMA. And that is a way to bring together a number of cultural organizations and networks when a disaster happens. So all of these groups work together. And this is something that really rose quite a bit after Katrina happened, because there was a lot of concern about how organizations could work together, not be working separately in order to help folks. And really, one of the things that's been very helpful to all these organizations is funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Jared mentioned that at the very beginning of our session. There have been grants from that organization to almost all of these components that are shown here. And it really helped to bring together disparate organizations and have them work together like a gear shift, work together well like gears. So I'm going to talk for just a minute and then turn things over to Jan about the Performing Arts Readiness Project. We have been around since 2017, and we have a really wide variety of organizations that we work with. You can see it's great because we work with both a sort of traditional preservation and conservation organizations like LYRASIS, like CCAHA, the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia, Midwest Art Conservation Center in Minneapolis, ICA just up in the Cleveland area, and NEDCC, the Northeast Document Conservation Center, which is a leader for information around the country. But we have our most important partners here, groups like the regional arts organization South Arts and the Arts Ready tool. We work very closely with the New Jersey State Council on the Arts, which I say is always in sort of a dead heat with Ohio, and being able to look at all these good projects and be thinking about disaster preparedness and be thinking about some great areas of outreach to their members. National Performance Network, based in New Orleans, which works with underserved organizations around the country. We mentioned NCAPER, also International Association of Blacks in Dance in the District, Maryland, and Virginia area, and the Western Arts Alliance. So it's a real mix of arts and cultural organizations, and they give us great advice on areas that we should work on, including a bunch of different areas. And that is the kind of outreach and community engagement we're doing here. It's the information resources on our website and all of our social media. And please take a look at our website as you have a chance. Our Circuit Rider project is actually consultants who can work in an area, whether it's the Cleveland, Ohio, or Denver area, helping organizations figure out what they need to do for disaster planning. And unfortunately, many of these Circuit Riders have actually come on site to help organizations recover from disasters. Templates and tools. I mentioned, and I'll talk in just a second again about the work that is available through D-Plan, but we also have something else. We have a sort of a slider tool that looks at what would happen if there was a disaster. How many performances would you miss? What were the cost per seats, and how much would the total of that be? And that loss, it's a loss indicator, a loss measurement tool. I also call it the board scaring tool, because in a lot of ways, it's something where you can say, this is why we need to have a disaster plan. Look at what would happen if we lost 4 or 5 different activities. We have training and conference program. The training is very important. We have 20 different webinars that are offered 3 times a year live with presenters. And then we have recordings of those that are available all the time. And I want to talk about this next piece and then ask Jared to jump in for a minute. But we have some great grants that are available for single institution disaster planning. We have grants of $7,250, which can bring in a consultant to help you develop a disaster plan. But we also include in that about $1,250 for you to be able to buy supplies like panic buttons or megaphones, bullhorns, more fire hydrants if you don't have enough. And our disaster network program can give an area, a city or part of a state, up to $25,000 to bring together networks for disaster planning. And I know, Jared, that you have some grants, and I just wanted to have a chance for you to mention those for a second.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Hey, everyone, going super off script here. It's not typical we jump in like this, but we're going to do it today because this stuff is really important, obviously. So Tom mentioned a lot of great resources from PAR. I hope you're taking notes or that you look at this recording after the fact. But what you should also know is that the Ohio Arts Council, too, offers some grant resources that could help support things like the creation of a disaster plan or potentially other sorts of accoutrement when it comes to emergency management. So I wanted just to flag 2 specific OAC grant programs that you ought to know about. And depending on your circumstances, it will depend on whether you are a nonprofit arts organization or an individual artist. So for the nonprofit arts orgs, the grant program that we recommend you look into is called Capacity Building. And the Capacity Building Grant Program awards grants up to $5,000 to arts organizations, nonprofits primarily, to work with a consultant to create something like a disaster plan. There's a lot of other ins and outs with respect to that program, eligibility-wise, and what you would need to apply. For instance, you would need to have some kind of scope of work with a consultant with a price tag on it. But capacity building is one grant program that we really recommend you look into. And perhaps you could parlay that into a PAR grant as well to create a really slam dunk proposal for these sorts of things. And if you wanted to learn more about the capacity building grant program, I saw Katie plopped into the chat there, the grant program guidelines. The application is actually open right now. The deadline is November 1st. So that is something you could do and look into right now today. There's a lot more in those guidelines that I recommend you look into. But if you have questions about the capacity building grant, refer to your regional program coordinator. That's Brianna Dance, Jim Sakosh, or Patrick Warrenbeck. One of those 3 folks would be happy to talk with you about the ins and outs of the program and what would and wouldn't be an eligible expense, okay? So that's capacity building for organizations. The flip side of the coin is if you're an individual artist, we have a new-ish grant program called Artist Opportunities, or ArtOps for short. And Artist Opportunities awards grants to individual artists to do things like professional development or artist-led projects that might involve the community. So again, Katie is on the nose here, plopping more guidelines into the chat. But what you should know is that disaster preparedness would fall under the spirit of the Artist Opportunities guidelines, and you as an artist could seek support to do things like documenting your art or archiving your work, creating a plan for your studio, stuff like that. So again, I am just breezing through the notion of these programs. There's a lot more information in those guidelines. Artist Opportunities, that's an annual deadline every May. So you've got some time to work up to this. But again, look at those guidelines, make a plan to apply. If you're an individual artist, either emerging or professional, you would be eligible to apply. So hopefully all of this together gives you a sense that there is support out there that you can seek and people ready to help you get connected to the right things to hopefully earn some money to do this stuff, because we know it ain't free and your time certainly is of value too. So I'll stop there. I could go on and on probably and bring in other people, but I'll just end on this with Artist Opportunities. If you have questions in those guidelines, Chaz O'Neill at the Ohio Arts Council will be your contact. His email and phone number is in those guidelines as well. So take some time for today and get familiar with the OAC staff on hand, ready to help you. Tom, thanks again for letting me jump in. I appreciate that.
Sure. And I just wanted to mention a couple of other things here. We have a special focus on festival safety, including running sort of in-festival education called the Art of Mass Gatherings, as well as doing festival safety assessments to take a look at a number of issues from safety, accessibility, environmental sustainability, and community relations from festivals. We work with arts administration programs across the country. We had a great presentation this spring with Ohio University's program, and we work really closely with emergency management programs. The last thing that I wanted to focus on for just a minute was the work that we do with D-Plan Arts Ready. Both of these tools were tools, D-Plan from the Northeast Document Conservation Center and Arts Ready from South Arts, that were around for a long time. We have now brought those together and have a program of subsidies for subscriptions to be able to work on developing these types of plans. And Jan has put together some great information to lead people through how to do some of this planning. So I'm going to turn things back over to Jan with the next slide here to talk more about NCAPER's advocacy services.
Thank you, Tom. As you see here, NCAPER was formed in 2006 after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita really brought to the at the forefront all those gaps in and getting help for artists and arts organizations. So we wanted to fill this critical void in arts assistance. So NCAPER is the only national discipline agnostic arts readiness, response and recovery organization within the arts sector. And we've developed a response system that serves as a safety net to complement the services of general relief providers as a stopgap measure for those not served by federal disaster programs. NCAPER advocates for preparedness and disaster support for the entire arts sector through publishing papers and other resource development ideas that will help people, give them tips, arts organizations, etc. We also facilitate post-disaster virtual convenings for affected artists and arts organizations to connect founders and service organizations and businesses who can help with their needs. We also train arts responders to work with their communities on readiness and mitigation programs. And here are some of our steering committee organizational members. You'll probably recognize some of these, like South Arts and New York Foundation for the Arts, Surf Plus, and of course PAR, and Entertainment Community Fund, which is formerly the Actors Fund. Also Music Cares, which is, you may not know, is the actual, the nonprofit side of the Grammys. They make all the money, and Music Cares really helps musicians and people who work with musicians. And I always say this incorrectly, as Tom always points out. I usually forget, I say, instead of roadies, I say groupies, but they fund the roadies, not the groupies. And grant makers in the arts. It's an important partnership as we work with areas that are under disaster, having disaster problems. Grant makers helps alert the community foundations and others in the affected area to let them know, hey, you need to get out there and help some of your constituents. So we all try to keep it, keep each other informed and intact as far as helping everybody out. And I mentioned publications. One on the left, the Cultural Placekeeping Guide. It was published in 2015, written by Amy Schwartzman mainly, who is on our steering committee and is a person who's worked a long time in arts, disaster and response. And it helps build a cultural network within communities. Like if you have a county arts council and performing arts centers and galleries, and try to kind of do a larger kind of preparedness plan for the whole cultural scene of your community. It's a very effective way of, like when I had a car kind of drive mistakenly into my office and it kind of smashed up the office. Didn't kill us, which was good. But I couldn't get back into my offices. So I was able to respond and get a place to stay. But if I had actually thought about something like this happening, I would have known right away, and I would have had all, I presume I could work side by side for the next couple of weeks while things were getting in order. So it's important to work as a cultural network. And then the arts organizations at a crossroads toolkit, what may be very interesting, this came out of COVID, but what we liked was it offers guidance on making critical decisions about your arts or cultural organization's structure and resilience and how to preserve your assets, whether you are growing or stable, kind of shrinking, or even if you're suspending operations. And one of the valuable tools in there is actually asset sharing. So many of us leave jobs and go to other jobs, and we take all our information with us. And what you can do is have conversations, so that I used to call it drop dead book. Like, what is your job really doing? And sometimes, we know job descriptions don't really tell you what somebody does. So to keep that corporate knowledge intact, if you look on ncaper.org, it's a really fun kind of transfer idea of conversations among staff. And then, of course, we had our federal field guide of federal disaster release in both in English and in Spanish, and they can be downloaded as PDFs if you have a lot of blue ink on your computer, on your printer. You can also order them to be in a binded form, and we have sent them often to areas where they can hand it out to artists. And it really, what it does is it puts into what I call English, or our Spanish, normal people speak, and it helps you, like, this is what you have to do. Don't worry about this. And the other interesting things is there are 11 other federal agencies that have assistance for artists and arts organizations if you dig deep. And these are all dug out for you. And who knows, you might get some assistance from the Department of Agriculture. So we have immediate days and weeks after a disaster, communications and IT are often cut off and limited. Artists and cultural workers may be displaced, and arts leaders may be scrambling to figure out how to help their constituents and colleagues. Essential guidelines for arts responders organizing in the aftermath of disaster, how to help and support your local artists. We have all these resources, and what I do is I send, like, the Arts Council or local Arts Council, state Arts Council, whatever. I send them these essentials, the essential guidelines to really help you. How do I help my stakeholders? How do I help these people? And this gives you that kind of that information. And what I'm looking for is really to have better networks of state and local activation teams, so that when disasters do occur, I know who to send all this stuff to. I know who to convene, and it makes it happen more quickly. I did this because I knew Emily Moses at the Kentucky Arts Council, and we just, out of that relationship and partnership, developed the idea of state and local activation team. And then, as Jared knows, we have the Crisis Analysis and Mitigation Coaching Program. And Jared is one of our coaches and one of our first certified coaches. And the idea is, with initial support from the Mellon Foundation, we have been able to, now we have about 20, I believe, certified arts responders. They're arts administrators who work either in the state, local, regional, or national level. And that whole idea of being a CAM coach is part of their job. And we have, with wonderful help from the Tremaine Foundation, we can do another 12, train another 12 coaches. I'm hoping to get all 50 states and territories. And you can see where the reaches, all those little stars there, are where our coaches have come from. And we even have Puerto Rico. And you can see where the states where a lot happens disaster-wise tends to be the states that are active. But we have a great partnership with Air Collaborative, and they have a wonderful facilitating technique, and that's what the coaches learn, and they learn how to work with their communities to mitigate when we know it's going to happen again, whatever it is. And so let's make sure we're better prepared. And so ABCs of critical skills for readiness planning. A, assessing what are your liabilities, which assets need to be protected and how. B, be nimble. If you're prepared and have thought about what ifs and when ifs in your organization, you can adapt quickly to crises and other potentially harmful situations. And C, communicating. I mean, it's like location, location, location. It's communicate, communicate, communicate. And what Tom and I found is what we're all bad at is communicating internally. We think, oh, audience, donors, all that, the visiting artists. We don't think about our internal, wonderful, wonderful staff people. And we need to make sure that happens. You would be surprised at some of the big organizations that we were teaching a class, and some of these students worked at these organizations, and they didn't know if they were going to be paid. They didn't know if they should show up. They didn't know anything, and that's wrong. It's just wrong. So communicate, can't do it enough. So looking back at assessing risk, critical functions, and this, if you go on the D plan, Arts Ready, make an account, it's going to ask you questions on collections and assets. And of course, I can hear the performing arts people going, we don't have collections. Yes, you do. I almost lost in 100 years of musical library for the Rochester Philharmonic when a roof collapsed. So let me tell you, performing art, you have instruments, you have and theaters have lighting equipment, a lot. So collections and assets. Another function is your people. What do you need to help and prepare your people? Of course, finances, and then facilities, of course, if you have, but not just the ones you own, the ones you tour in and the ones you store in, as Tom mentioned. And of course, IT, we never can be too prepared for that. Communications again. Community, how well do you communicate with your emergency response people in your city, in your county? Do you even know who they are? If you don't know who they are, they probably don't know who you are either. And as we have found out, when you are known to emergency response people, they come quickly, they help, they want to help, and they're wonderful, wonderful partners. And of course, programs. How can you do programs differently, or what needs to be assessed? And then training and drilling. This has to happen, and it has to be on your mind, not just a yearly function. Some things have to happen more often. So one of the things, it's not rocket science. I mean, are you city or are you rural? What services do you have, and how close are they? I mean, I don't mean to rag on Houston, but you can have a performing arts center across the street from a chemical plant. You may want to think, what if we're in a performance and we have to get everybody out of there because something blows up? So know what in the buildings around you, and what are other local events happening when you're doing your programming, and public infrastructure surrounding your building. If you have a railroad going through, you may also want to figure out, timing of things, and what happens if somebody jumps the track or whatever. And if a river is down the street, rivers tend to flood. So this is easy stuff to start talking about. You can do it in staff meetings. You have to have a discussion, and also these inspections. I had a story of the guy who owned the building. I'm a structural architect, and so you don't need to have any of this stuff. Well, I almost died as the rest of we all had carbon monoxide poisoning, and it was pretty severe. And one woman passed out going home. So make sure the people who need to inspect, the experts, make sure they're the ones telling you this is okay, your plumbing's okay, your masonry, fire suppression, drainage. But you can look for daisy chains and crumbling plaster, those little things on the ceiling, the leftover, there might have been a leak there, and clogged drains and drip pans. Tom has a multitude of stories about things that he has found in his going around and inspecting places. But we're talking about all these physical and natural disasters. We all know that human-made disasters are our biggest threat. So just looking at this list, even with all the negative effects of climate change, the fastest growing disasters are human-made, and so you have to deal with that. You have to figure out how to make this safer for everyone. And now I'm going to turn it, Tom, be nimble.
Yes, and I'll be nimble because we want to leave some time for questions and answers as well. But what we want you to think about is this idea of response and adaptation, because there are changing issues. And, these started in COVID, from travel restrictions to developing virtual program. The Dance Theater of Harlem, the Dallas Black Dance Theater, if you go to their websites, you can see how quickly they were able to act, because they had plans and they focused on what they could change. So I think the biggest thing we want you to think about is, what can you do? What happens when your organization is faced with any of these types of things? And yes, natural and human-made disasters, but organizational disasters like leadership shifts, loss of major funders, cyber attacks, which are happening with greater regularity. All of those things need to be built into your disaster plan. What we don't want to have happen is, people, we have a lot of things to do to think about our next performance. We may be at our organization just creating and surviving, but, are we thinking about this sometimes, rarely, or never? We do need to have this in the front of our mind because of the effects we're seeing from climate change in some other areas. So just building this awareness, working with any of the resources you've heard of today, as well as working with OAC, can all be good directions to go. Because disaster planning should not just be a priority. Uh-oh, that went sideways. Oh, that's interesting. It should not just be a priority when it becomes a priority. Have it be a priority now, and it can be less difficult when a disaster hits. You can mitigate some of that disaster. So don't wait. And as Jan said, this whole idea of communicating as you build the plan, working with your external staff and your external stakeholders to think about communications during and after a disaster is very important. These can be areas of communicating internally and externally often. providing access to archive performances, developing human interest stories of performers and staff, even if you're unable to perform, and collaborating with current allies and new partners. The newest partner, and Jan and I didn't have these in many of our lists, but now we do all over the place, is the public health department in your area. They're able to help us think about what to do if a disaster does happen. With that in mind, I think we'll turn things over to giving you good information on a couple of these organizations that we have talked about throughout our program. And then I want to turn things over to Jared for a moment or two to lead any questions that anyone might have. And again, you can put those in the Q&A area, but Jared too may have some questions as well.
Yeah, that's great. Tom and Jan, thank you. Wow, wow, wow. That was a lot of really great information. I'm just going to remind folks this is being recorded. So if you need to go back to anything, it will be on the OAC's YouTube page shortly. Give us a day or two's time, but it'll be up there. Lots of great resources. So yes, as Tom mentioned, we've got just a smidge of time for some questions and answers. So make use of the Q&A box on your Zoom channel. You can also throw them in the chat function too if you wanted to. But to grease the wheels a little bit while folks might be thinking and ruminating on what's on their mind, I've got a few things on my mind that I want to pose to you. And this goes to both of you, Tom and Jan. So, boy, it feels like a disaster service staff member would be of use at every organization, like a full-timer, just based on what you've discussed today, that really everyone ought to have this part of their job responsibility. And Tom, I think you mentioned that. You said you don't want a lone wolf. You want everyone to be thinking about emergency management, disaster preparedness. The notion of a drop dead book was mentioned by you, Jan, which I think is a great idea. Tell us what your actual job description is in your own words. And where and how does disaster preparedness fall in that? So my question to both of you is, obviously it's not feasible to hire a full-time staffer when it comes to disaster services, but what are some specifics in terms of how to get the full staff thinking, talking, doing about this sorts of emergency management? And I want to focus specifically on the staff. You mentioned the board scaring, which I think is a great idea too. They also clearly have a big role to play in all this board scaring tools, but the staff, the communication of it all. Do you have any tips or tricks to make that part of your organizational culture for an organization that's just sort of starting on this journey? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, in that it is the best way for a leader to demonstrate inclusion and diversity, really make that part of how you operate, and saying, we want to know from each and every one of you as we sit around this table. We want to know what is important, what could go awry, and what you do, what makes you kind of wake up at night or whatever and think about, ooh, if that happened. I'll tell you, when that happens, when you give that kind of affirmation, I think that your job is so important. I had a wonderful theater director who would tell us all, I was one of the ones chewing gum upstage or whatever, I wasn't ever that big a part, but he made us all feel that we were vitally important to the success of the performance. And when you really believe that, you get the information you need, and then that's what creates that culture of preparedness in the organization, because you'll have it in take part of the staff meetings. Okay, what was scary this week? What do we need to focus on? What could go wrong? I mean, Sullenberger didn't think for the first time when he landed on the water. He'd rehearsed that, believe me. He knew that may have been his plan Z, but it was part of what he had thought about. What what if. And those what if conversations are important to have with everyone.
Yeah, and I agree with Jan. And one of the things that you can do is there are tabletop exercises that you can do in this blue sky time that are out there that are sort of these disaster builds. And how would your organization and how would your people react if there was a storm and a tree fell through the front window of the theater and that kind of thing? And those are helpful. And the idea of if any type of minor emergency crisis or disaster happens, debriefing after that and saying, how did we do how well did we do recovering from this? That is something that emergency managers do after every emergency that happens. We should be doing that too. And it's, again, a way to get all the organization's viewpoints if something like this does happen.
Beautiful. Thank you to you both. So quick time check here. We're a minute before the hour. So if you have more questions, folks listening, you've got Jan and Tom's emails right on your screen here. I know I'll speak on behalf of everyone here. Don't be shy. Let us know what you're thinking and how you think we can help. And I'm including the Ohio Arts Council, of course, in that as well. Hop on our website. There's phone numbers for all the staff, no matter the department. So Katie, I see your question. Tom or Jan, can you address this in like a 30 seconds time about debrief after COVID in a formal way? Has anyone done that yet? Are we doing that these days?
People have been doing it. And actually what we have seen is they talked about what can we change if we have to go through this again. So it's, again, the mitigation of whether it's COVID or something else that might be a health problem, talking about what you did that worked well and what you did, especially the communications areas, that might not have worked well, and documenting those into your plan. So there have been organizations that have done a lot of work in that already.
That's great. Thanks, Katie, for that question. And Katie Monahan, we're going to toss it back to you to close us out. Thanks.
Thanks, Jared. And thank you so much again, Tom and Jan. This was an absolutely fantastic presentation, great resource to be able to offer all of our attendees today. And as Jared mentioned, we did record today's presentation, and a copy of that recording will be available on our webinars page and our YouTube channel. And I will be sending a direct link to all of you who are on the call today. So you can look forward to that, if not tomorrow, by Monday at the latest. So thanks again to everyone for taking the time to tune in. And once again, thanks so much for our fantastic presenters. It's been great. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.